Hello and most welcome to 1266. I will continue with the trodden path of Roberto Mangabeira, but now oddly conclusions are popping up, or very interesting as such. It seems that this is deconstructing the inner and the outer. So I made this a sub-chapter of the book, and next 1267 I will do my take on the inner and outer. It has extended implications beyond what the scope could be perceived as initially. Much further. I said before, I think this book is one of the most important. It has not been neglected, but I think because of it's difficult to understand. That's problematic for that. Now once it gets understood, marvels are coming. We left off at 211. The influence of these ideas can be effectively resisted only if there is an alternative to them. One of the aims of this argument about the inclusive reality of time, and more generally of the whole argument of this book, is to offer in the discourse of natural philosophy the sketch and the basis of another agenda. The cosmology needed to achieve this alternative as science, not simply as natural philosophy, does not yet exist, or exists only in fragmentary form. Much of the empirical material and conceptual equipment needed to begin developing it is, however, already at hand. The turn in cosmology has consequences for the future of physics, and indeed of all fundamental science. Our understanding of any part of nature depends on our view of the whole to which these parts belong. Such assumptions are no less decisive when they remain implicit, as they often do. When we come to approach the universe historically and affirm that both the constitution of nature and its regularities are susceptible to change, we further strengthen the sense in which an understanding of part of nature relies on an understanding of the whole universe and its history. A region of the universe or a period of its history can then no longer be counted on to reveal the most basic truths of nature, even when we study it in its connections with other regions. In the dominant traditions of physics, universal truth is revealed locally. Local discoveries and insights are scaled up into theories of universal structure of nature and of the laws and symmetries governing this structure. Physics has resorted to such scaling up throughout its modern history. Scaling up underlies the use of what we have called the Newtonian paradigm, the first cosmological fallacy. A view subordinating structural to historical explanation and refusing to accept either the constitution or the regularities of nature from the reach of time and change robs scaling up of legitimacy. It does so by suggesting that the most significant features of a state of affairs are those resulting from its placement in the history of the universe and from its consequent relation to the changing repertory of natural kinds and of laws and symmetries of nature. Cosmology, converted into a historical science, ceases to be peripheral. It displaces particle physics as the most encompassing and fundamental study of nature. In the history of thought, many philosophers have argued for the unreality of time, not just as the defenders of the standard interpretations, nature, representations of general relativity do for the non-existence of preferred cosmic time. I put aside conceptions of the shallow and ephemeral character of the phenomenal world in the history of philosophy. By contrast to underlying unified and timeless being, to address all the arguments against the reality of time that have been especially influential in recent thought. These arguments deserve attention because their authors have developed them against the background of an engagement with cosmology and have often explored their cosmological implications. The summary consideration of these views here cannot do them justice. It may nevertheless help elucidate, by contrast, the content and the basis of the temporal naturalism that we embrace. Remove my shirt. The summary consideration of these views here cannot do them justice. It may nevertheless help elucidate, by contrast, the content and the basis of the temporal naturalism that we embrace. The objections to the reality of time that I have in mind fall into two main groups. one family of objections exploits the consequences of the contrast between time as an objective feature of nature and time as the human agent experiences it and talks about it. These objections belong to the history of modern idealism. The other set of arguments emphasizes our inability to give a clear and precise account, in particular a mathematical statement of what we mean by saying that time is real, and by supposing that it flows interruptedly. The intended effect of both sets of arguments is to make it seem that the idea of the reality of time is incoherent, contradictory, or incurably vague. We do not really know what we mean when we say that time exists. Time, therefore, cannot exist. A notable instance of the first set of objections is MacTaggart's argument for the unreality of time. It is an argument that trades on the confusions of an agent who recognizes that time must involve change, but who cannot make sense of the idea of time from the standpoint of his agent-oriented experience and his language of past, present, and future. If all that we have is before and after, we do not possess real time unless we can also fix the references of our talk of future, present, and past. However, this talk is incoherent. Every event must be, and yet cannot be, simultaneously past, present, and future. If we say that it is future, present, and past at different times, McTaggart's obvious objection to his own argument, we simply assume the reality of a time that we have failed to clarify, allowing ourselves to be caught in a vicious circle or an infinite regress. Once we have discarded both our tensed and our tenseless discourse about time, we are left with a timeless ordering of events. Considering, however, the idea supported by the cosmological discoveries from which we take our point of departure, that the present universe has a history with a defined beginning and a likely end. In such a universe, change happens through causation. The aspect of reality by virtue of which it is susceptible to uneven or differential change within the world of plural and connected phenomena is what we call time. The sense in which we are entitled to distinguish earlier and later events in the universal history depends on whether the universe accommodates a preferred state of rest and a preferred time. If no continuous preferred cosmic time exists as the prevailing interpretations of general relativity propose, there will be only multiple times inseparable from the placement of matter and the geometry of space. An observer may then be able to distinguish earlier and the later moments in the history of the universe only from his standpoint. his historical narrative will lack validity for observers placed somewhere else. If the constitution of the universe is such that throughout its history it can support preferred observers who can discern the passage of cosmic time, notwithstanding the inability of other observers to escape the relativity of simultaneity. Any event, anywhere in the universe, fits on a single cosmological timeline. Our position on Earth enables us to approximate with certain corrections the circumstance of such preferred observers. The way in which our temporal experience lines up with preferred cosmic time, or with its dissolution into the alternative cosmic times of the prevailing interpretations of general relativity, will not be determined by the idiosyncrasies of our experience or the syntax of our language. It will be ultimately determined by the facts of the matter about the history of the universe and by our place in this history. We can expect to have difficulty in translating our agent-oriented vocabulary developed to suit the scale of human activity into the discourse of a historical cosmology, or in translating the latter into the former. We have no reason to be either discouraged or disoriented by such difficulties. They exact a small part of the price that we must pay for the exercising the prerogative to think far beyond our station. These considerations serve as the beginning of an answer not only to MacTaggart's objection to the reality of time, but also to all objections leveled from the perspective of idealism. They exemplified the standpoint of a naturalism that sees both causality and time as internally related and primitive features of nature. They interpret our linguistic equivocations and ambiguities as a sign of the limitations of natural language in representing the nature and history of the universe, rather than as evidence for the non-existence of realities that we have many other reasons to credit. A second class of contemporary objections to the reality of time argues that we are unable to state with clarity and precision what we mean when we claim that time exists. In particular, we cannot make sense, especially mathematical sense, of the flow of time. More generally, we cannot distinguish time clearly and coherently from other aspects of reality. If we cannot either explain it or distinguish it, we may well conclude that it does not exist. There is an element of validity in this family of objections. However, the objections to the reality of time, to which I now refer, turn the true significance of these problems upside down. The seat of the greatest difficulties to the elucidation of time and of its flow is mathematics, the indispensable but dangerous tool of physical science. In its use to account for the nature and attributes of time, natural language is accommodating but vague. Mathematics is precise but recalcitrant. In chapter 6, I argue that both the power and the limitations on mathematics in the representation of nature have to do in large part with the trouble that mathematics has with time. The relations among mathematical or logical propositions are timeless. All mathematics can best be understood as an exploration of a simulacrum of nature, a version from which time and phenomenal particularity, inseparable in nature from each other, have been banished. Having begun in the study of the most general aspects of nature, shape and plurality of number, mathematics soon found its chief inspiration in itself and its secondary inspiration in the tasks presented to it by natural science. Its radical simplifications are the source of its power, but also its limitations. Given its trouble with time as well as with phenomenal distinction, it is more useful in understanding some parts of nature than others. Its trouble with time implies as well trouble with history and with any historical understanding of natural processes. It lends itself more readily to the development of a structural science than to the elaboration of a historical one. An important aspect of the quarrel of mathematics with time is the difficulty that it has in representing the flow of time, the mathematical idea of the continuum, traditionally modeled on the real number line, can represent flow only as a series of slices. The dominant modern program of discrete mathematics is inadequate to the task of representing the vulgar idea of the continuum as uninterrupted, non-discrete flow. The sequence of real numbers remains a series of steps. The steps fail to melt into a flow by virtue of being uncountably infinite. Analogous difficulties beset the mathematical representation of other attributes of time and natural history. It does not follow, however, from such difficulties that we should reject what mathematics can state only imperfectly, or state only by some approximation to the corresponding realities. Mathematics is the most powerful instrument of science, but not the infallible one. It is not equally suited to all the tasks that science has to reason, to undertake, or to all the phenomena that it has reason to study. A physical picture inspired by physical intuition and developed with the help of physical equipment may turn into a theory that is disciplined by observation and experiment without being exhaustively described by its available mathematical expressions. Instead of regarding these problems of the mathematical representation of time as a sign of the unreality of time or of its attributes. do better to take them as a reminder of the difference between mathematics and physics. There remains another source of suspicion of an argument in favor of the reality of time, including the existence of cosmic time. It may seem that in the effort to uphold that reality, we surrender to our perceptual experience, when much of the progress of science consists in revolt against the illusions of experience. We experience the earth as flat and discover that it is not. And so it happens, the argument goes step by step with every aspect of our perception of the world. Consider how incomparably more central the reality of time is to our pre-scientific understanding of nature and of ourselves than is the flatness of the earth. That the earth is round rather than flat, and despite its roundness, we do not fall off it into space, is a curiosity and a marvel. Having discovered it, we can retrospectively reinterpret in its light many aspects of our perceptual experience that our ancestors had misinterpreted. However, the roots of this fact in the general shape of our experience are narrow and superficial. By contrast, no aspect of our experience is more pervasive to all our experience and more far-reaching in its consequences for how we understand the workings of nature and our place in the world than is the reality of time. No aspect of our existence or of our perception is untouched by it. The concepts with which we understand the manifest world, and the words with which we state our understandings are all penetrated by implicit reference to time. Holy moly, I say, that is just beyond belief. Take a homely example of a concept that crosses the divide between natural language and the language of science. The concept of a ruler for measurement. It is part of the concept of a ruler that is not change, not at least in its local environment, with regard to other things that do change. In this respect, the ruler is like a clock. It refers implicitly, whereas a clock refers explicitly to time. From this simple instance of time reference, we ascend to instances that are central. First and foremost, our understanding of ourselves as mortal organisms moving in real and irreversible time toward death. If time is unreal, all bets are off in our perception and in our understanding of what it is, what with respect to the manifest world around us, as well as to ourselves. Our perception of reality is then radically disconnected from the real. It becomes questionable how we can continue to do science at all. We may perform certain operations, for example, provoking particular particle collisions, and treat our ideas about particle physics in this case as a pragmatic predicate of such capabilities. However, our causal language, as well as our experimental practices, will always be time-related. The expulsion of time does not amount to the correction of an isolated element in our perception, which once corrected, we can continue to relate to the remainder of our experience. It dismantles the whole of our experience. It does so to such an extent that it undermines the procedure on which science has always depended, of departing from perception without severing its link with perception. There remains in even the most revolutionary science a dialectic between our direct experience of nature and its theoretical correction. Denial of the reality of time threatens to suppress this dialectic. It would then be as if we were in the hands of a malevolent demon, like the one Descartes evoked, or as if the powers of perception and understanding with which natural evolution has endowed us were so narrowly suited to the goal of short-term survival that nothing of cognitive value can be gained by their exercise. Why then would we have reason to trust any speculative conception, such as the idea of the unreality of time, that is unsupported by direct operational confirmation? And what could such confirmation look like, given that operational confirmation is bound up with change and causality and change with time? The philosophies in ancient India and Greece, as well as in modern Europe, that denied the reality of time, did so as part of a metaphysical program. They supplied an alternative account of reality as it is and as we experience it, and connected this account with an approach to the conduct of life. Denial of the reality of time is not an idle speculation to be pursued as we could pull out this master thread of our experience and leave the rest in place. A striking feature of the worldwide history of philosophical ideas about time is that neither of the most influential traditions of thought about these matters can be reconciled with what science has already discovered about how the universe evolves and about how the nature changes. One tradition associated with what we might call the project of classical ontology, exemplified by Aristotle's metaphysics and by most strands of subsequent Western philosophy, upholds both the reality of time and the existence of a permanent repertory of natural kinds or types of beings. Another tradition represented by many of the philosophical systems of ancient India and by Western philosophers as different as Spinoza and Schopenhauer, denies both the reality of time and the existence of any such permanent catalogue of beings. It treats our experience of temporal change and of phenomenal distinction as an illusion obscuring the reality of unified and timeless being. The truth suggested to us by science is, however, incompatible with both these contrasting views. There is no permanent list of natural kinds, because time is inclusively real. The mutability of natural types, as well as of all regularities of nature, is the corollary, not the opposite, of the reality of time. Such a view, the closest to the truth on showing of modern science, speaks with the weakest voice in the history of philosophy. These remarks go to the reality of time, not to the existence of a preferred cosmic time. It may be objected that the same considerations that weigh against renouncing the idea of the reality of time fail to count in favor of reluctance to abandon the notion of global time. Indeed, there is nothing necessary about the existence of such time. It depends on features that are better described as factitious than as contingent. That the universe happens to be constituted and to have evolved in a fashion that allows for a preferred state of rest and for preferred observers placed in a neutral position with respect to that state. Time may exist in some qualified but significant sense, even if preferred cosmic time does not. We will then desegregate the idea of time, treating it as a bundle of notions that can be dissembled, some of them to be retained, but reinterpreted, others to be rejected outright. Nevertheless, for the reasons that I adduced at the beginning of this section, the rejection of preferred cosmic time might well be regarded as the beginning of the end for the reality of time. It is enough to recall that if no such time exists, it is no longer clear how or in what sense the universe can have a history. Only the local or partial histories of non-global time will then exist. Such histories would be inseparable under the leading interpretations of general relativity, from the disposition of matter in the universe and the physical geometry of space. They would be incapable of fitting together to form a master narrative. As a result, cosmology could not complete its turn into a historical science. I do not execute in detail the intellectual program sketched in this section. Its execution would require cosmological work beyond the limits of this essay in natural philosophy. Smolin will address many of these themes and develop many of these ideas, exploring their significance for the theoretical and empirical agenda of cosmology. Within this broad terrain, the remainder of this chapter and chapter 5 undertake 4 tasks. Taken together, they represent the beginning of a pathway in the direction that I have just described. They offer a natural philosophical prolegomenon to a cosmology that could carry out this intellectual program. The first task is to describe what it would require for time to be inclusively real. No conception of the inclusive reality of time can be useful or stand a chance of being vindicated unless we can specify its meaning and the properties that it ascribes to time. We can do so only with a degree of precision that is allowed by the vagueness of natural language and by the temporal recalcitrance of mathematics. To say what the inclusive reality of time means is not to show that time is in fact inclusively real. However, unless we can further develop the idea of its inclusive reality, we cannot hope to distinguish a cosmology or a philosophy of nature informed by these views from rival conceptions. We fail to fulfill one of the conditions for an agenda of work that theory, observation, and experiment can hope to pursue. The second task is to consider the role that a conception of the inclusive reality of time can play in a cosmology that sees itself as a historical science, because it defines the history of the universe as its central subject. The third task is to discuss the implications of this view of time and of the discovery that the universe has the particular history that it does have for the mutabilities of the laws, regularities, and supposed constants of nature. Such a discussion must show on what terms we can reconcile the mutability of these regularities of nature with the stability in the cooled down universe. The fourth task is to address the major problem to which this view of mutability and the stability of the laws of nature gives rise. The problem that we name the conundrum of the meta-laws. We have reason not to deny either that any transformation of the laws is itself law-governed, in derogation of the inclusive reality of time, or that it is uncaused. It may be caused without being law-governed. At the beginning of a solution to the conundrum of the meta-laws lies in regarding causal connection as a primitive feature of nature, like time itself, with which it is bound up. It lies as well in appreciating that the recurrent and law-like form of causality may not be manifest in all expressions of nature. It may be the most characteristic of the cooled-down universe, the traits of which we should not mistake for a permanent features of nature, according to the argument against the second cosmological fallacy. This more selective intellectual program serves the larger program outlined in this section as a preliminary. It also reveals the character and some of the implications of temporal naturalism that we propose. Time as the transformation of transformation. That time is related to change is a proposition that has been a persistent theme in thinking about its nature both in philosophy and in science. However, the change that is implied by time has often been represented as movement, that is to say, in spatial terms. The result is to favor a form of thought affirming the primacy of space over time. It is a slant evident in views as far apart as Aristotle's metaphysics and Einstein's general relativity, as general relativity is commonly understood. However, it is a bias that we cannot accept if we are to grasp what an affirmation of the radical and inclusive reality of time implies. Time is indeed about change. Its relation to change, however, need not and should not be represented in terms that make time seem to be an appendage to space. Time is the contrast between what changes and what does not change. More precisely, it is the contrast between what changes in a particular way and what either does not change or changes in some other way. It is the relativity or the heterogeneity of change. Within this view, time is intimately and internally connected with change. Change is causal, time is change. In the spirit of these propositions, we should take inspiration, not discouragement, from Marx's remark. It is utterly beyond our power to measure the change of things by time. Quite the contrary, time is an abstraction at which we arrive by the changes of things. If we fail to recognize the intellectual opportunity bound up with the resulting conceptual confusion, we may be further discouraged, as Thomas Hobbes was when he wrote in De Mundo that time has always been whatever anyone has wanted it to be. The significance of the association of change and thus of time with causation remains circumscribed so long as we continue to think that causal connections are only instances of unchanging laws of nature. In fact, as I argued in chapter 1, causation is a primitive feature of nature, and there may be states of nature in which causal succession fails to assume law-like forms. If change were uniform in pace, scope, direction, and outcome, it would not be change, other than in a greatly diminished sense. We could not notice it or register it. There could be no clocks, because clocks are devices that measure one set of changes by reference to another set of changes. That is so whether the clock is a device that we build or part of nature. Might we not still remember an earlier state of affairs, even if all states of affairs change uniformly and in concert? Even in principle, we could not. There must be a form of consciousness, or its physical expression in the brain, that changes on its own, by its own procedures, as well as at its own pace. For time to be perceptible. The thesis that time has to do with the uneven character of change immediately suggests the view that time can exist to a greater or lesser degree. The deeper and more comprehensive the unevenness of change, the greater becomes the reality of time. It is most real if change itself changes. To claim that change changes is to say just what the words mean. The way in which phenomena change also change. Consider a simple example. To which I later return in my discussion of the conundrum generated by the idea of the mutability of the laws of nature. the forms of genetic recombination or the supervening regularities of sexual selection did not exist before the emergence of the phenomena they shape. There were new types of changes associated with new types of phenomena. Neither the kind of things involved nor the types of change had existed before. When they arose, change changed. The change of change was accompanied by a change in the kinds of things that exist in the world. On this view, the full reach of the reality of time is revealed in the transformation of transformation, which thus becomes another way of defining what time is. What science has already discovered about nature in the course of its revolutionary history confirms abundantly that in this one real world, change changes. Nevertheless, the implications of this fact for the understanding of time are almost never fully drawn. A crucial test for the acceptance of such an understanding turns out to be the temporal status of the laws of nature. Many have argued mistakenly that the assumption of timelessness of laws of nature is indispensable to the work of science. Yet this assumption, on its face to contradict the idea that change changes, to hold that change changes amounts to allowing that the laws of nature may change. The mutability of change can be reconciled with the immutability of the laws only if we resort to the view that the change of the laws is itself law-governed. However, this move resolves the contradiction only by qualifying the idea that change changes. The higher order laws would then be proof against time. A simple thought experiment helps clarify both the grounds and the implications of the idea of the reality of time. The content of the thought experiment is nothing other than the circumstance that is conventionally labeled Laplacian determinism. The world is governed by a single, unchanging set of laws. Any variety in the pace, scope, and direction of change is itself law governed. The laws of nature fully determine everything that has ever happened or will ever happen in the world until the end of time. They do so minutely by what we know as causal determination. We may not have discovered the laws of nature to the extent necessary to see how they completely shape the behavior of all particulars in the world. But they do. Infirmities of knowledge are not to be mistaken for disorder in the world. If we knew enough, we would be able to infer from the present moment all past and future events, not only those that have happened and are therefore irreversible, but all those that will happen. Indeed, in principle, from the state of affairs at any moment, it is possible to infer the states of affairs at all other moments. Chance and catastrophe, including the production of vast reversals out of relatively small disturbances, are ruled out. So is genuine novelty. What may appear to be new is the working out of what existed before. In such a world, time would exist only in a vastly diminished sense. For the mind with sufficient, that is to say, complete knowledge, the whole of the history of the world is recapitulated or foretold in the present moment. Such a mind would be the mind of God or of natural science, insofar as it takes such a divine insight as the regulative ideal, whose fulfillment it progressively approaches. Under the Laplacian regime, the reality of time is compromised. And circumscribed. The deeper our the deeper our level of insight, the less weight we have reason to grant to the reality of time. In these circumstances, the difference between the causal sequence of events and the connections among logical or mathematical propositions would shrink. The relation of consequences to their causes in our understanding of nature would more closely resemble the relation of conclusions to the premises in our mathematical and logical reasoning. There would be more reason to think of mathematics as an ante-vision of the workings of nature. Our world, however, is not the world described by this thought experiment. Here are 3 reasons why it is not. A first reason is that we have increasing reason to think that the range or depth of the adjacent possible, the scope of what can happen next, given a certain state of affairs, is not constant. It varies in the history of the universe on the basis of the cosmological models that are now in the ascendant. It must be imagined to have been much greater in the formative moments of the present universe than it has on the whole become in its subsequent evolution. The combination of probabilistic explanation with the hidden variables theories may seek to subsume the periods of the universe and the forms of nature that are marked by greater degrees of transformative opportunity under the aegis of Laplacian determinism. However, the more the nature approaches the condition I earlier called causality without laws, as the distinction between laws of nature and the states of affairs that they govern fades, and as natural phenomena fail to present themselves as a differentiated structure, the less plausible the attempt to uphold Laplacian assumptions will be. A second reason is that the way of representing regularities in nature that the thought experiment portrays has, in the history of science, proved effective only in the context of the Newtonian paradigm. The explanation of paths of nature on the basis of the stipulated initial conditions that define both a configuration space and laws governing phenomena within those boundaries. The explanation of the initial conditions is always relegated in this explanatory practice to another explanatory account. The stipulated initial conditions of the former become the explained phenomena of the latter, because of its feature as well as because of the other considerations I have invoked. The Newtonian paradigm cannot be generalized to the world as a whole. A third and more fundamental reason is that the obstacles to the application of this Laplacian view are not merely the results of transitory deficiency in knowledge. They result from the grounds we have to believe, on the basis of what science has already established, that change does indeed change, and that such transformation of transformation forms a major part of the reality of nature. That change changes should not be interpreted as an invitation to conclude that we are therefore liberated from causality, that the universe is open or creative or possessed of any of the attributes that would enable us to believe that it is somehow on our side, offering us solace for the indifference of nature to our concerns. A view what happens to causation and to causal determinism when change changes must be a major part of a conception of the reality of time. Attributes of time, non-emergent, global, irreversible, and continuous. Consider on the basis of this initial idea of time as as the transformation of transformation, 4 sets of additional attributes that time must have if it is to be radically and inclusively real, to be irreducible to anything else, and to admit no exemption to its rule. The description of these attributes develops the conception of time implicit in the previous section. What science has already discovered suggests that in this one real world, time does have these attributes, or to make the same claim in different words, the view that it possesses these attributes is more readily reconciled with our established knowledge of nature, all things considered, than the view that it does not. The resulting account of time nevertheless conflicts with theories that have exercised great influence in contemporary science. What we must decide is whether we have better reason to affirm the reality of time, or to cling to such theories, even in those respects in which they contradict the full acknowledgement of that reality. The first attribute of time is that it is not emergent. Time is what remains, quipped Richard Feynman, when everything else leaves. We can conceive of a world in which time would emerge. For example, a world in which change fails to change, or in which the emergence and disappearance of time result from changing configurations of space. That is precisely the case in ruling interpretations of general relativity. That time is non-emergent implies that it cannot adequately be represented in the dimensional language often associated with non-mathematical formulations of general relativity. It is not an appendage to space. The non-emergent character of time forms part of what it means for time to be inclusively real. If time were emergent, it would by definition derive from other, more fundamental realities, such as timeless, and even objectless laws of nature. The special and general reasons to believe in the inclusive reality of time, considered in the previous section, are consequently also reasons to regard time as non-emergent. The second attribute of time is its cosmic or global character. There is a time of the history of the universe that is not simply a collection of local times. Its existence enables to say, for example, that the universe is about 13.8 billion years old. At least in our universe, we can translate the speculative idea of cosmic time into the more precise and restrictive notion of a preferred cosmic time. Such a time can be registered by preferred observers whose neutral position in the universe fulfills requirements that I earlier specified. In the history of 20th century physics, every view that began by disputing the existence of such a global time ended by discounting or denying the reality of time altogether. Thus, one might say that with respect to the thesis of the inclusive reality of time, the denial of the global character of time has regularly served as a first step in the formulation of a view robbing time of some or all of its reality. Resistance to this first step, however, may seem to contradict much that the physics of the 20th century revealed about the workings of nature. It may appear a reactionary concession to our perceptual experience of time, no more justified than the resistance to correcting our sense that the earth is flat. To understand in what sense the affirmation of the global character of time does and does not conflict with the legacy of the 20th century physics, it is necessary to say some more about this attribute of time than about any other. The thesis of the global unity of time is easily misinterpreted. The chief difficulty in understanding it is the tendency to interpret it from the standpoint of a spectre that continues to stalk our commonplace beliefs about nature. Newton's idea of absolute time. The life of this idea is perennially renewed by its proximity to our unreliable perceptual experience. Cosmic time must be interpreted from the perspective of a relational view. The hallmark of such a view is that time be understood in terms of both relative change and causal connection. In such an understanding, the ultimate grounds of the causal unity of both the universe and its history are the variability, discontinuity, or irregularity of change within this nevertheless unified and historical universe. Time on this view is global because the singular universe has a single history. Global time is perceptible and in principle measurable because change is not uniform over the universe and its history.